So welcome to the Herland report, Mr. Phil Giraldi. You are a counterterrorism specialist and a military intelligence officer with the CIA. You used to work with them for many years, with over 20 years experience abroad, both in Europe and an extensive knowledge also about the Middle East. And we're so happy to have you on the show, a known columnist and writer here in the United States as well. Thank you for taking the time. We're discussing the Middle East, the rise of the neocon movement, the changes in foreign policy affairs after the fall of the Berlin Wall or the fall of the Soviet Union. We saw a remarkable shift in foreign policy with the rise of the neocons, the Paul Wolfowitz, the Dick Cheneys. Already at the early 90s, and four-star General Wesley Clark has spoken about that, of course. His experiences from the Balkan Wars and worries as he saw that something really was happening. And he's been wondering and said that there really was a coup in the foreign relations system here in the United States that the people were never told about.
Well, I think it's fair to say that American foreign policy has shifted considerably. I think you would have to admit since the time of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. Particularly with Reagan, a lot of what we refer to as neoconservatives started to appear in the Pentagon and in the State Department, and they were behind a lot of these changes. They had essentially the neocon point of view is that the American Republic, I hate to use that phrase, but the American Republic should be playing a leadership role internationally, essentially telling other countries what is good for them and what they should do. And they package this whole thing by saying it's for democracy, it's for free trade, but that's only part of what it is. What it really is dominance by the United States in terms of dictating to other countries what their policies, internal policies, external policies should be. And this is tied in with globalism, again, because the factor that's important to understand here is that there are a few things that the neoconservatives always believe. The first thing they believe is that since the United States has the power to tell much of the world what to do, it should exercise that power. And the second thing they need, because they have to keep the American taxpayer paying for the weapons and for the soldiers and for the neocons in their think tanks and other places, they have to create a threat. And the threat has been, at least for the last 20 years, Russia. Russia is a plausible threat. There was a Cold War before. This is essentially a fake threat because Russia has not threatened the United States, has not threatened Western Europe, as basically its economy is smaller, much smaller than that of Europe, much smaller than that of the United States, and its armed forces are smaller. So this whole thing is a phony threat. And so that's another thing the neocons always do. And then they have other things that are their guiding principles. Most of the neocons are Jewish. And most of them, all of them, are very deferential to Israel and to Israel's leadership, which has been Benjamin Netanyahu for many years now. So they are always deferential to Israeli interests, and this explains why a lot of the things that happen in the Middle East that don't make any sense, like Syria. Why is the United States obsessed with Syria? It's not a threat, but yet the United States is playing this game with Syria. But Syria is an issue for Israel. So we see a lot of these things playing out in that fashion.
Yes, and the question of Syria is really interesting because I believe there came out a Defense Intelligence Agency report from 2012 was revealed by Judicial Watch in 2015. A memo there to the State Department in which the alliances in the Syria war was described very precisely to go to the White House, of course, and explain the lines of who are allied with who. And this memo clearly stated that the alliance in Syria was the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq were allies with the Western forces. And then you had, of course, Turkey, Iran, Saudi, allied with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And that's quite something very different from what we hear in the media as we're told all these stories about the horrifying crimes of the Muslims.
Yeah, this is an interesting aspect of America's war on terror, which is the fact that we have very often created the terrorist groups, and we've supported them when it was desirable to support them. They were handy, they were available to use against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The United States, for reasons of probably Israel more than anything, has been opposed to Syria ever since 2003. And there was the Syria Accountability Act, I think it was 2004, which started a lot of the Arab Spring in some places and encouraged groups to come together in opposition to their governments. And of course, if you go way back, the United States in Afghanistan created Al-Qaeda. And that's a fact. And the United States, by invading Iraq, created ISIS. And so there is a lot of hypocrisy in all this. Donald Trump claims that we are only in Syria to get rid of ISIS, which everyone would agree with. But at the same time, we have protected ISIS in Syria. And it's clear that we like having ISIS around as an excuse to keep a presence in Syria and a presence in Iraq. So the hypocrisy at every level.
It's remarkable too, going back to the same DIA report from 2012, where it was stated as well that there could be a chance of getting an insurgency in the eastern parts of Syria, which could provide for the ISI to establish an Islamic caliphate in that region, thus posing a threat to Assad from the north. This was also a part of that DIA report, and it's peculiar. It's from 2012, and it's already talking about the establishment of an Islamic caliphate, which only came 2 years later. And when you look at the origins of ISIS, I mean, those were like 800 ex-Ba'athist, rugged fellas in the northern western part of Iraq that suddenly, from being impoverished in the current Iraq, becoming the world's most wealthy terror organization.
Yes, well, of course, part of that is due to the fact that they were allowed to take over oil fields and sell the oil in Turkey and places like that. But this was all allowed. As a Russian friend of mine commented, he said ISIS was selling all this oil with huge convoys of 100 trucks at a time, and somehow the United States didn't see it. But when the Russians saw it, they attacked it, and they stopped it. They stopped it immediately. And so the United States was allowing this to go on. And of course the Turks were too, because the Turks were profiting from what was going on. So a lot of the money came from there. But also bear in mind that the United States was funding other insurgencies and terrorist groups at the same time. And a lot of these groups, when they arrived in Syria, immediately joined ISIS and gave them their weapons and gave them what money and they had obtained from CIA and from the Pentagon, and all of this went into ISIS. So it was again, hypocrisy at a level that it's almost unbelievable. Very little of this was reported. In fact, almost none of this was reported in the mainstream media in the United States. You could find it if you go to the alternative media and read my articles or articles by people like myself who were skeptical about all this. But the mainstream media would not touch it. And they are still, you're still seeing the same process going on mentally with what's going on in Venezuela. We are getting one side of a story from the government, US government, and from the mainstream media, and you have to look elsewhere if you want to find out that there is another story. So.
And pertaining to the ISIS segment too, in 2014, we all remember how all of a sudden, all throughout Western media, in all the media outlets, there were these wonderful photographs. And the thing is, look, I've worked in the Middle East for many years. When you know people, you are able to see which photographs are photographed in the completely Western structured way to fit the front pages of the Western newspapers.
Sure.
So I said that all the way from the beginning in 2014. My goodness, this is a new movement and an attempt to enter from another angle into the Syrian conflict. So the question also about the collaboration when looking into those beheadings, remember we saw these Western journalists turned out not to be journalists after all, and a couple of them were already dead long time ago, and others, and we saw on the backdrop of this desert sand, remember this Mr. Jihadi John who was like beheading somebody. It creates a lot of terror into the Western public and an immense fear of Muslims in general.
Yeah, it does that, and that's one of the very worst parts of it. And of course, the rest of it is as I mentioned before, is to create fear, to create a threat, because the neoconservatives, the establishment people who are part of the military-industrial complex in the United States, which has its counterparts everywhere, these people, they need a threat. They need something that makes people afraid. And that's why people don't question when the government does something terrible in response or is hypocritical in terms of what it's doing. It allows people to look the other way and say, no, they're making us safe. But that's the way the whole game is played. Perfect example of the lying about Syria, of course, is the white helmets and their activity. And they're totally fraudulent. These were people used by the terrorists. Essentially, they themselves were terrorists, and these people were used to make a movie that won an Academy Award in Hollywood. George Clooney singing their praises. What did George Clooney know? I mean, the last time he was in a dangerous situation was in a movie. And these people know nothing, but they have been bought. They've bought into the narrative. The narrative is an establishment narrative. Everybody is comfortable with it. So that's how this happens.
I think the White Helmets are about to win the Nobel Peace Prize in my country, Norway. They have been nominated several times, so that will probably happen, judging on the politicization of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. But in Stockholm, the power structures are so corrupt, so I do think that has dramatically changed since that time. Regarding the White Helmets, we've seen so many photographs and documentation with them corroborating and being in the same pictures as al-Nusra Front soldiers. One of the good things with the Arab world nowadays is that everybody has a cell phone.
Right.
We've seen how they're filming the scenes of an alleged attack, then filming how everybody comes and rearranges the scene of the same alleged attack, and then we read about the attack the next day in the mainstream media. All this is now common knowledge. Still, there is no critical reaction against the White Helmets in the mainstream media. How do you explain that?
The explanation for why there's no exposure of the White Helmets is that the establishment prefers to have them seem to be the guys in the white helmets who are doing the good thing and saving people and so on. But of course it's all fraudulent, and it's a mechanism used to make the Bashar al-Assad regime look worse, look like the bad guys. This is really what it's all about. And this is part of the manipulation of the media. It's the fact that once upon a time, the international media had correspondents overseas. There are people actually that were paid to live in a country and observe personally what was going on. They don't do that anymore. The major news media will have somebody in Paris, maybe somebody in London, always somebody in Israel. This U.S. media I'm talking about, and so they don't have any eyewitnesses to anything going on anywhere else. I noticed I did a little report on the white helmets at one point, and it turned out all of the reporting on the white helmets was being done out of Beirut and London. So nobody who was an eyewitness actually was providing information except second-hand and third-hand. So you could put any kind of lie into the system if that's your ability to verify the truth about what you're writing. And sitting in Beirut, you don't know what's going on with ISIS in Syria. Sitting in London, you know even less.
And still, after finding that out, still this observatory is spewing out its information. It's just amazing that such leading pieces of information are not picked up in the Western press. So are we watching the end of investigative journalism and reporting and the end of objective reporting? Is it some sort of the entry of an age of propaganda where the media no longer reports news?
Well, I think you could make an argument that the media has always lied when its interests were at stake. And every time there's a war, certainly, whenever there's a war, the lying is done from both directions constantly. But we're looking at situations now that aren't wars. I mean, they're local wars, but they're not a war that is involving London or involving Washington in a serious way. But these people have basically packaged what they give to the media, and the media, which now the media in the United States, it's 5 or 6 major media companies, and all of these companies have good vested interests to stay on good terms with the government. So it's, as they say, one hand washes the other. And this is what the media in the United States in particular has come to. So I think you're right. Good investigative journalism, you're going to have to look to alternative media. You're going to have to look to people who are on the ground in these countries and are reporting what they're seeing. But the alternative media does not have the resources that the mainstream media has. So it's always going to be deficient in terms of what kind of stories and what kind of impact it can come up with. But yeah, we've lost the media war, and I blame the media almost more than the government for the lies that are coming out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phil Giraldi, for joining us here, speaking about current affairs, the Middle East, the white helmets. Thank you for taking the time to coming here to the Herland Report.
Well, thank you for having me on.